shopping carts. And so we like to use extreme users. You can see in this image here on the lower right-hand corner, it's a deli meat slicer. I love this story. Also, there was IDEO, the design firm, was redesigning pill bottles and asked an 85-year-old woman with arthritis, an extreme user, how her experience was with pill bottles. And she said, it's fine, it's not a problem at all. And so they decided to observe what she did with these pill bottles, and discovered that when she came home from the pharmacy, she walked into the kitchen, put the pill bottle through the deli meat slicer, chopped the top of it off, and poured her pills into baby food jars. So a great example of observing how someone uses a product and really works around how bad the product is in order to make it work for her. And then just on the top, we see a version of many versions of an empathy map, in which not only when we interview people, we want to understand, what they're thinking and what they're doing, but we also want to dig for emotion. We want to dig for how people are experiencing something and how they're feeling about the experience, as well as what they're thinking about. And in our next session, we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So we're building empathy, we're listening and observing, and there are some very well-designed tools and checklists and resources that we can use in order to do that. Another way we can understand our customers and build empathy is with journey maps. These are two examples of a journey map, both of them government. And as you can see, not only do they have the sort of, well, you can't see very well, but the actual moments or activities or milestones or touch points, whatever term you want to use for a customer's journey, but you also importantly see the sort of line that goes up and down, which is how people are feeling. And we usually dig for that. I was at a meeting a couple months ago, and it was a state employee who said, I just wish we could educate the public about all the different agencies in our department and what they do, because then they'll contact the right department. And it took everything in my whole power to not say, yeah, or how about we just actually understand the experience of the customer and make it easy for them so they don't need to know what each department does, but just get the service that they want. So journey mapping can be really helpful in helping to understand the experience that people have with our services and our products and try to make them work better for people. Once we have done some empathy interviews and journey maps and observing and other ways to really understand our customers, we will end up with a problem that we think is the right problem to solve. There are some other tools we can use to define and redefine our problems. This photograph on the left is a great example of a story well known in human-centered design worlds, in which a group of people in an office building complained to the office building manager about how slow the elevators were. And instead of, well, his first instinct was, oh, do I need to put in another elevator? Do I need to change the algorithm about, what elevator comes when? Do I need to, ramp up the engines of the elevators? All of which were going to cost a lot of money. Someone said to him, why don't you just actually ask people what the problem is? And when he did, what he discovered was it really wasn't that the elevators were slow. It was that they were bored waiting for the elevator. And waiting for the elevator, the solutions for that, installing hand sanitizer, mirrors, video screens, is really different than having to put in a whole new elevator. So your definition of your problem often defines your solution space. We have some other tools that we use in defining our problems. One is the 5 whys, which is the really simple, just like a 5-year-old asking the question why 5 times to try to get to root cause, and also an abstraction ladder. And I'll talk more about those in our next session. Boy, Hannah, I'm teasing for the second session already here. But this particular webinar today is really just touching the high points. but both 5 whys and an abstraction ladder are useful for defining our problems. And this is another example that I really like. This was at the beginning of COVID, or a couple months in, the governor of California went to his Office of Data Innovation and said, I want you to create an app that will allow people who have lost their jobs as a result of COVID to understand what all of the government resources are that they can use, and financial resources and tax benefits and unemployment insurance and so on. And this often happens to those of us in government. The governor, the mayor, the secretary, has a new idea and wants to implement it. And fortunately, in this case, the people, the leaders in the Office of Data and Innovation said, instead of actually creating a new app who needs another app, how about we just start inserting on each agency's websites resources from other agencies that are also available to people. So this is the Employment Development Department, where they issue unemployment insurance. And on the bottom of the screen, once they qualify for unemployment or don't qualify for unemployment, there's a little box that also includes links to obtaining the Earned Income Tax Credit, applying for TANF, and energy assistance. So sometimes we are handed a problem and then handed a solution. And it's, I believe, incumbent upon us as good change makers in public service to just ignore for a moment what the solution is that we've been handed and see whether we can solve it in a different way. So once we've done all our research, we have a problem that we think is pretty stable and reflective of what people really need, and we have done our research, we want to start developing insights from the research that can guide our solutions. In this case, this was the very first human-centered design project I worked on. It was a project that was instigated because there were so many long-term unemployed at the end of the Great Recession that they started coming into government offices, and it was a whole new customer group that the organizations really had never dealt with before. And so we did a whole set of interviews. We had empathy interviews, we did journey maps, and tried to better understand this new customer group. And although it sounds obvious right now, at the time it was a real insight and revelation to us how important emotional states matter when people walk through the door of a career center. If you've just lost your house or your apartment or your car, you're really not interested in going to a workshop on how to network on LinkedIn. You actually you don't even need a job, but you need money. And that's really different than someone who's applied for unemployment insurance and then applied for hundreds of jobs on the internet, never heard anything back. It was just a big black hole. There was never any feedback. Those people were really discouraged and they needed some encouragement. And those people were really different than people who had lost their jobs because maybe their industry had gone away, or the occupation that they were in wasn't that interesting to them ever. And they really needed to understand ways that they could explore new careers. So what we had typically done was that when people walked through the door of the Career Center, they went through a sort of one-size-fits-all workshop in which everyone heard the same thing. And in that workshop, these different kinds of people with the different emotional states were listening like 5% of the time. So as a result of this understanding of insight about emotional states, many of the career centers changed their intake process into one that was more like the Apple Store, where you walked in and there was a triage at the beginning that allowed us to help provide the right services to the right people in the right sequence of time. So once we have insights that we are going to use to drive our finding solutions, we start to ideate or brainstorm. These are two examples of a project I did in Minnesota, I think it was Minnesota, in which we we were brainstorming how might we provide warm handoffs of resources to employers. I forget what the other one was, but this is an example of using Miro. We used during COVID, and now just after that, I use 2 collaborative white spaces, either Miro or Mural, that are terrific for doing a lot of the activities in human-centered design. But this is the same thing. You could be sitting in a room and using sticky notes up on a wall. But the idea is that we want to ideate a lot, that quantity is more important than quality. Wild ideas are useful because even though they may not be the right solution, some kernel of an idea within that wild idea might be something we could actually do. So we're going for quantity. If you have 100 ideas, 20 might be great. If you have 10 ideas, 1 might be great. So ideation is an important part of this process. And once we have an idea that we like, that we think might work in solving the problem that we have, we will prototype and test. And as I said earlier, this is something that we rarely do in government. We have an idea and then we figure out how to roll it out to everyone. This is an example of, on the left-hand side, a prototype of a year-long training class. This was in the city of Detroit. They discovered that the people who were welcoming our students and the people who were walking through the door of the organization had very little training and really needed to know more about what all the services were available. And so instead of designing the whole class and spending, months and months designing the class, we literally put one piece of paper together. This is the Welcome Team Academy. We describe the format, how people will be recognized, what the schedule was like, what the content of the training was, and just took it to the people who were working on the front desk and doing welcoming, and to their supervisors, and said, is this the kind of thing that you would want to go through yourself? Is this the kind of thing you'd want your staff to go through? And we were able to get a lot of input and change actually quite dramatically the content of the class before we even started putting real pen to paper on the class itself. You'll also see we do a lot of prototyping with physical things, actually taking a concept and building it with our hands. I live in California. This is going to sound super woo-woo California, even though I'm really a New Yorker and I'm kind of cynical. But sometimes our hands know what our brains don't. And so prototyping with physical things can sometimes give us insight into our solutions that we wouldn't get otherwise. Here's some more examples of prototyping and testing. On the left, this was a design sprint that we did in Cambridge, Massachusetts on the future of work. And below that is a prototype that we did up in Oregon, where we literally just prototype different signage. As you can see, the sign that people used to see when they walked through the door was a red stop sign, not very welcoming. We just tried different ways to word. This one is "Wait, you're up next," which is the one that won the test, if you want to talk about it that way. We just literally tried different ideas with the people who are going to be affected by those ideas, and we're able to learn from the receptionist when people came up to the desk what the mood of their customers were. And honestly, just that tiny little change in wording for the sign helped us. And then on the right is an example I really love. This was also in Detroit. We were going to create an orientation video that was going to go on their website. And we were, before we started filming anything, literally, we just cut out a piece of paper, and this man read a script with a piece of paper as if he were on a video screen, and the guy in the back was taking notes about what was working and what wasn't working. So I would just say one of the things that I really learned over the years of practicing human-centered design is that our customers, they don't want a product, they don't want a website URL, they don't want a workshop, they want a program. Most people who are looking for government services want to get something done. They want to make their life better, or they want to get the benefits they are eligible for. And we end up getting very focused on our solutions rather than really stepping back and seeing what people really need. I love this quote from Antoinette Carroll, who founded the Creative Reaction Lab, that says, all systems, including systems of oppression, inequality, and inequity, are by design, and therefore they can be redesigned. And I've found over the years that really in government, going back and really looking at our policies to understand whether they foster inequity or inequality, and then working on trying to redesign them by listening to our customers is really useful. I'm working on a project. I see one of our fellows on the screen here, in which we're trying to fix some policies that have been given to us, handed down to us from years and years of use. And we're doing what we call policy scavenger hunts, and going back and looking at our policies and trying to see whether they are helping or harming our customers. And if we see that they're harming them, then we go through a design process. So what I'd like to do now is just give you a few minutes to process what you've heard from me, and then we'll come back and talk about it some more, and you can put some more questions in the chat. I see that there are a bunch of them, and I'm going to wait until we do Q&A to answer them. But, and I'm wondering, Hannah, if you can put people into breakout rooms. If we have just 3 people in a room, we're going to spend 12 minutes total. Just introduce yourself first, pick someone to keep time, and just talk for a couple minutes, each of you, about what intrigues you or what concerns you about using human-centered design in your work. The other 2 people will listen and not comment. Then each person will go and get a turn, and then we will come back and spend a few minutes just putting your observations in the chat and talking about them. Will that work, Hannah?
Yes, I'm going to put a few more than 3 in a room, just because sometimes not everyone is able to
True.
put their microphone on. So I'm going to I've created breakout rooms, and I'm opening them all for you all to head into.
Awesome. And we'll see you back here in 12 minutes. Yeah. So yeah, Stacy said most of the people in my agency have empathy or person-oriented, but they're much more interested in efficiency. There are ways to talk about design thinking that we can maybe talk about next time that help a little bit. I think, for example, I didn't use the terminology human-centered design when I was doing the work at the Department of Labor, because I felt like they would be uncomfortable talking about humans. So that's why I use the word customer instead of human. Yeah. Pamela says, reinforce the critical need for this process to be incorporated in all that we do. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about, is it a mindset, or is it the skills? Is it the process, or is it the mindset? And I think it's both, but definitely if your first instinct is to go, whenever you get a new assignment, a new problem that you're working on, if your first instinct is go talk to the people and listen to the people who are going to be affected by whatever you're doing, I think that's, you're starting on the right track here. Yeah, and Agile is a way of working, and you can still be human-centered. Absolutely. All right, are people mostly back? I can't really see.
Yes, everyone's back.
Okay, awesome. Well, I hope that was helpful. Sometimes as humans, and as adults in particular who are learners, we learn by debriefing. We learn by talking to each other. We learn by reflecting and thinking. And so whenever I teach, I like to build in a lot of time for reflection with each other, because it helps us kind of have the learning sink in, and you get a different perspective from other people. So I just want to end this part of it, and then we'll talk about lessons that I've learned in implementing design thinking in government, is just this Venn diagram that is very ubiquitous in human-centered design teachings and process. And that is that in design thinking, we always start first with people. We start first with what's desirable for the people who are going to be affected by a problem, a program, a product, a service. But we also need to think about both viability and feasibility. In business, viability might be marketing, brands, and so on. And feasibility might be technology. In government, viability is, is it legal? Is there any law that's against it? Do we have the funding for it? Do we have an appropriation? Do we have all of those things that are really about the viability of something that we want to do? And then feasibility is really, do we have the staff? Do we have the funding? Do we have the buy-in from management and so on? And it's really that sweet spot in the middle, that little triangle in the middle of those three circles, is where innovation happens. I love the examples of the Fire Festival, for example. Like, everybody loved, if you've heard of the Fire Festival, everybody wanted to go to this Caribbean island and have this big music festival. And the people who were sponsoring it were making a lot of money. Everybody signed up, but it was completely not feasible to do. That, there were tents that were lying on the ground, and there's no water, and there was no facilities. And so you can have great ideas, but if they're not feasible and viable, you can't actually do much with them. So, and getting buy-in is often the hardest part, but there are ways that you can do it, and we'll see if we have time to talk a little bit about that. So I just want to go through a few lessons that I've learned about using design thinking in government. The first is really just scoping the problem right. Our problems in government are often so big. There's so many wicked problems that you all are dealing with every day that are really hard. Many of you are working on, intractable social problems. And design thinking, we want to start particularly at first by keeping them human and subjective, and making them something that you actually can solve, tangible, like products or services. I think it's also really important when you're starting out to really identify what your assumptions are. I have lots of stories about that. When things don't go so well, it may be that your assumptions are getting in the way. And of course, as I've been saying all along, don't presume a user's need. I'd also say that, small is good. I have a colleague who works in a city, also in the workforce development world. He runs a career center, and in the parking lot where the customers come in before they go into the actual office, there's a sign, and it doesn't say Worksource Center this way. It says good people and great jobs this way. Now, that's just a tiny sign, but honestly, the people who walk through the door are primed to have a much better experience than if it just says Worksource Center this way. So sometimes very small things can actually make a big difference, particularly when they add up together. So really scoping the project, particularly when you're starting out at first, that's human, that's small, and that is actually also something that you care about. And particularly, Seth, to your point about getting buy-in, starting with a problem that your boss has, that if you solve it for them, they're happy and more likely to have you do some more, is a great way to start. So one of the things that we've learned over the years, this is work that has been done by Dr. Amy Edmondson at Harvard, is this notion of psychological safety and how important psychological safety is for creating a more innovative workspace, a more innovative team. And psychological safety is not like being nicey nice to each other. I worked in a state agency in which everybody was nice to each other and then walked out in the hallway and like, talk smack about each other. Um, it's actually about candor. It's about being willing to take a risk and having the rest of your team be okay with that, particularly if it doesn't pan out. So asking for help or so on. These cards on the left-hand side are cards that were developed by a colleague of mine named Beth Skubis, who worked at the CIA. And she handed out these cards to her team every week. They were anonymous, and they every week answered the questions or looked at the statements that were on the card and answered them from their perspective. And then every week they would sort of tackle one of the issues. And the more we think about innovation, it really is about coming up with new ideas and trying something different and challenging the status quo. And all of those are approaches that require that the rest of the team feel okay with and feel like there's psychological safety in the organization. The second is just for those of you who are managers and leaders, is to create a climate and culture of innovation that helps to support it. So this is related to the psychological safety, but I would say that in addition to training people on how to use human-centered design and other innovation methods, we've learned that you really need to build some kind of infrastructure for ideas to be lifted up and seen and then actually implemented, which also requires that people have agency over their own way of working. And last but certainly not least is granting permission. Permission documents and permission strategies are really important. We have now, for those of you in the federal government, Joe Biden issued an executive order a year and a half ago, in which it says that anyone using federal dollars needs to include people affected by the policy, program, service, or product in the design process, in the development of those policies, products, and services. Now, there's no teeth to that executive order. There's no appropriation for using design thinking, but it's permission to do things differently. The other thing I think I will end with is, and then we can talk, is this notion that I learned about several years ago. I'd always heard the phrase early adopter, and I kind of felt like I was one, but I didn't really understand the whole curve. But this was developed by Everett Rogers back in the 50s, I believe. And like most things in life, there's a bell curve for people who like innovation and people who don't like innovation. But this is a good news chart for me, because what we've learned, and there's actually a terrific video by Simon Sinek called The Law of Diffusion. If you Google that, you'll, and maybe Hannah, you can write that in the chat, that also talks about this in the same way. Innovators are people who come up with great ideas, like all the time. They're just idea machines. Steve Jobs, lots of people who are innovators and idea creators. Early adopters are those people who are, they stand on line overnight to go to the next Star Wars movie or the next Marvel movie, even though they could wait till the next day. They always have the latest iPhone or whatever that is. They're people who, if you go to them and say, I have an idea, they're like, oh, cool, what is it? Let's talk about it, as opposed to, okay, go back and do your job. And if you can capture those innovators and early adopters when you are talking about a new idea that you have for doing something differently, they're the tipping point. In other words, if you can capture about 14 to 16% of any group of people and get them to be with you on a new idea or a new project or a new solution, the early majority will come along because they'll see that you've done something, you've been successful. Or early majority people want to see something, they want to see some proof that it works, but then they're with you. And the late majority are skeptics, and they really want to see a lot of proof. And they also kind of want to realize that if they don't go along with it, that maybe they're going to be forced to at some point. And laggards, who are the people who traditionally we think about and worry about all the time, they're not opposed to your idea. They're opposed to any new idea. So we spend so much time worrying about the people that, cross their arms and say, it's never going to work. Forget about those people. When you're trying to implement design thinking, when you're trying to implement a new idea in your organization, just forget about those laggards. They're never going to get excited about your idea. And we can just forget them because they don't matter in terms of innovation adoption. Once we've got the early adopters in, it will be the tipping point. Now, it may take a while, but I think this is good news. If you have an organization with 100 people, if you got 14, 15, 16 people on your side, you can make change. And I think that's a great message to wrap up this presentation. And I would say just very last is, I'm an innovator, I'm a troublemaker. I've been a troublemaker since the very first day I walked into the government office and the unemployment insurance office and saw the paper documents in a big folder and said, if we put these in a different filing method, I just immediately start tinkering with how to do things better. But you got to bring people along. You can't do it by yourself forever because it's really lonely and really hard. And innovation is a team sport. So I'm going to end my presentation here. The next session, I'm going to dive into the 5 phases into more detail and hope we can have some more conversation about them. And then last, I will, I'm actually, Hannah, you don't know this yet, but I'm bringing a colleague of mine in with me, and we're going to give you some examples of human-centered design projects at the federal level and the state level and the city level. So I think that'll be a lot of fun, and hope may spark some ideas for you. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to, I don't know, I can try to go put my video back on.
Yeah, let's see if it works,
Let's see if it works.